Amen. Merry Christmas, church. It's good to be here with you. What is it for you that makes you feel like you're home for Christmas? Maybe it's a particular set of decorations, the stockings that someone hand-stitched years ago, a particular collection of Christmas tree ornaments, some of them matching, some of them received as gifts over the years, some of them made by school children out of popsicle sticks and pine cones. Maybe it's a particular food, a particular recipe. Maybe it's mom's turkey and stuffing or grandma's apple pie. Maybe it's Starbucks' eggnog latte, which is an abomination. Maybe it's a particular tradition. And sometimes they're odd, right? Like my family, our tradition is this. We have Christmas Day brunch, and we have brunch, and then we just spend the rest of the day kind of being lazy together, and we get the giant, 1,000-word, 2-page crossword from the newspaper that comes out on Christmas. We spread it out on the coffee table, and we spend the whole day just huddling around this crossword, working on it in shifts, periodically taking breaks to graze on the leftovers from Christmas brunch, and somehow that's Christmas. One of the great things about Christmas, if you can get it, is that feeling of being home. That feeling that everything is right with the world, that feeling of peace and wholeness. That feeling that for this brief moment in time, you've found a refuge, a shelter from the whirlwind of life. That first Christmas, the Jewish people were home, but it didn't feel like home. In fact, it hadn't felt like home for some time. 1,000 years before, they had been a great nation, prosperous, united, strong military. Things were going well. Truly, it seemed like God was with them, and they had this amazing temple in their capital city of Jerusalem, and that was the place where Yahweh, their God, the strongest of all the ancient gods, dwelt among them. And they were the people of God. Then the Babylonian Empire rolled in and conquered them, destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed their beautiful temple, the dwelling place of their God, and took them into captivity, and took the whole nation as captives and brought them to Babylon, to the city of Babylon, to live as captive people for several generations. This is a period known as the Babylonian Exile. And it was an absolute identity crisis for them as a nation. Now, if you've been through a hard time in your life, you know that it's the hard times that make you wonder, is God with me? Was he ever there? My purpose in life, is it what I thought it was? My direction, my destiny, is it what I thought it was? It's the hard times that get you wondering. Maybe you're in a hard time right now. If that's you, let me just pause and say we'd love to journey with you. And I'd love to talk to you after the service. You can also fill out a prayer card that are in the seat backs, and you can drop it at the Welcome Center. We'll follow up with you. So this much diminished nation then, during this period of the exile, they did a lot of thinking and a lot of writing, actually, because they were trying to figure out this question: are we still the people of God? Is God still with us? Eventually, after about 70 years, they were allowed to move back to Jerusalem, although they were still under foreign rule. And they began rebuilding their city, rebuilding their lives, and most importantly, they rebuilt the temple. And so they rebuilt the temple, but the book of Ezra tells us that many of the older priests, Levites, and other leaders who had seen the first temple, the one that was destroyed, they wept aloud when they saw the new temple's foundation. They had seen the previous temple, and this new temple was much more modest. And if anything, it was a reminder of how far they had fallen as a nation. They were home, but it didn't feel like home. The exile was technically over, but in a deeper way, at a deeper level, the exile was still ongoing. As a nation, their bodies were no longer in exile, but their hearts still were. That being home feeling, that everything is right with the world feeling, that feeling of refuge and safety, it wasn't there. And maybe you felt that as well. The prophets and the rabbis began to teach that one day a new leader would come, a new king, like the ancient leaders Moses or David. And this new king, this new leader would usher in a new golden era for the Jewish people. Now, in the ancient world, you set apart a king for kingship through a ceremony called anointing, where you would pour oil on the future king's head. And so they began calling this promised king the Anointed One. In Hebrew, the word is Messiah. In Greek, the word is Christos, which we transliterate as Christ. So here they were technically home, but it didn't feel like home. But they believed that this king would come and that this king would make it right again. He would restore blessing, restore God's favor, restore the fortunes of their nation. Jesus came that first Christmas, and what's interesting is that the Jews very clearly described him using this language of him being the Messiah, of him being the exile ender. And so Luke chapter 2 tells us the story of Jesus' birth. We read part of that. And then it says a little while later, Jesus is brought to the temple, and they encounter a man there named Simeon, old man, who had been looking forward to the consolation of Israel. And God had told him that he would one day get to see the Lord's Messiah. And so he sees Jesus and he says, there he is, and he rejoices. Jesus grows up. And right before his public ministry begins, a prophet named John, we call him John the Baptist. The prophet John the Baptist came before him and announced his coming. And when he did so, the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, describes it using these words. He quotes Isaiah 40. He says, as is written in the book of the words of the prophet Isaiah, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Now, Isaiah 40, if you read it, it's a prophecy about the ending of the exile. See, when Jesus arrived, the people thought, this is him. He's the Messiah, so he's the exile ender. It's going to be the end of the Jewish exile. And in a sense, they were right. But there's another thing going on here. If you study the Old Testament, what you'll find is that it seems that as the Jewish scribes and scholars and rabbis and teachers were thinking through what it meant to be an exiled people, they started to realize that exile was not just a right now reality for their people, but that in some way exile, longing for home, was part of the human condition. That all human beings are in a kind of exile. All human beings are longing for home. That for all of us human beings, sometimes we're home, but it doesn't feel like home. And so they wrote some stuff about it. People throughout history have written stuff about this. In his great sermon, The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis referred to this idea as our lifelong nostalgia, our longing to be reunited with something in the universe from which we now feel cut off, our longing to be on the inside of some door which we've always seen from the outside. And what human beings have reflected on for many years is that maybe all of our getting and spending and achieving and self-justifying and marathon running is just trying to find that thing that will make us feel like we're home. The Jews already knew a story with that theme. They had been telling it for generations, passing it down by word of mouth, but it's probably during this time that they decided to write it down. And it's a story of a man and a woman who live in a garden that is also a temple. They live in a garden that is also a temple. They live together with God, dwelling together with God. They're living in peace and harmony. Everything's good. They are home in the truest sense. But they break their relationship with God, and it says that they were sent out of the garden. Another way, if you look at the Hebrew words, another way to translate it would be they were exiled from the garden. The man's name was Adam, which means human. The woman's name was Eve, which means life. And it's like the Bible is telling us the story of human life is that all of us belong in a place where we're living in a close, fruitful relationship with God. That's our home. And we're not there. That all of us are in some way exiled from that kind of life. So when you study the Old Testament, what you realize is that the Bible is kind of telling us that there was the immediate exile of the Jewish people, but that there's also a greater exile of all human beings. We're exiled from relationship with God, the relationship that we were intended to have. Isn't it true that like the Jewish exiles, sometimes even when we're home, it doesn't feel like home? Isn't it true that our souls are longing for something else? St. Augustine, one of the church fathers, famously wrote, speaking to God, wrote, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." Our hearts are longing for home. Jesus would grow up to become a rabbi, prophet, sage, and he presented himself as the Messiah, as the ender of the exile. But the great twist in the story is that Jesus came not just to end one exile for one group of people, but to end the big exile, the greater exile that all human beings experience. And it's interesting because you read the Gospels in the Bible, the biographies of Jesus, and you'll see that there's kind of two agendas, that people around him are saying things like, "So, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Like, are we gonna, are the Jews gonna get on top again?" And clearly, whenever Jesus states his mission, he's talking about something else. He says things like, "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." He says things like, "The Son of Man came to seek and save those who were lost." You read the biographies of Jesus, and what's clear is that he's presenting himself as the exile ender, but everyone thinks he's ending the smaller exile, but he's ending the greater exile. He's ending the spiritual exile, that existential thing that we human beings experience, that restlessness that lies in every human heart. See, here's the big idea. That first Christmas, God broke into history so that we could come home. God broke into human history because, like the Jews, even when we're home, sometimes we're not really home. And that feeling that we get when we're home for Christmas is, in a way, just perhaps a shadow of the greater homecoming that Jesus came to bring to all of us exiles and wanderers and seekers. In a few moments, we're going to sing the Christmas carol, "Come Thou Long Expected Jesus." And here's what the great Charles Wesley wrote in that song. He wrote, "Israel's strength and consolation, hope of all the earth thou art, dear desire of every nation, joy of every longing heart." See, because Jesus was the exile ender, he was Israel's strength and consolation. That's what Simeon called him. But he was more than that. It's not just a story about Israel. It's not just a story about one time. He's the joy of every longing heart. All of us are hoping for more. And Jesus is the fulfillment of that hope, that longing. So whatever it is for you that makes you think, I don't know if I'll ever be home again, Jesus is inviting you today to know how it feels to come home. We invite you to consider that today. We invite you, along with Jesus, to come home for Christmas. Long ago, the Irish people developed a tradition where they would put a candle in the window of their home at Christmas. And that was partly a way of honoring the Holy Family and remembering the Holy Family, Mary, Jesus, and Joseph. But it was also an expression of hospitality to say to people who were coming home for Christmas, or even travelers who were passing through, you're invited into this home. And so as we light the final Advent candle, the Christ candle, maybe that's the invitation for you. Maybe the invitation for you. There you go. The lifelong nostalgia, the angst, the unrest that we so often feel, that our souls feel, that's our souls remembering home. And Jesus came that first Christmas to end our exile. He came that first Christmas so our souls could come home. The table is set, the crossword is laid out, and the candle is in the window. You're invited into this home. Why don't we stand as we sing?